New Zealand. Why is everyone leaving this paradise? We're talking about one of the most spectacular countries in the world. Legendary landscapes, fresh air, a hard-working government, excellent education, a well-functioning healthcare system, people treating each other with respect. When you describe it like that, it sounds like a country with no problems, right? But people don't want to live there, and they're leaving. Why is that? While countries around the world look on with admiration, why are the people living there choosing to go? Let's talk numbers first. The population of New Zealand is just 5.3 million. The number of people immigrating from this small country is so high that it actively competes with some much larger nations. Let's really let that sink in. There's prosperity, no war, no poverty, no economic crisis. So why are people leaving? The truth is, most of those leaving are young people, educated, ready to start their careers. In other words, the very people who would carry the country forward. The population is still growing, but that growth is being fueled by immigration. People are being brought in from outside to replace those who leave, and that itself is creating its own set of problems. On top of that, there's a flow going in the opposite direction. A well-known group of Australians is migrating to New Zealand. Who are they, and what are they trying to do? We'll come back to that. But first, we need to properly understand one thing. How did New Zealand's economy become so uniquely its own? Being remote is both a blessing and a curse. New Zealand is extraordinarily remote. So remote that it doesn't even appear on some world maps. And that remoteness is what shapes everything about its economy. Practically anything you can do in New Zealand can be done in Asia for less money, at a larger scale, and with easier access to transport routes. This isn't just true for industry. Need help with finance? Singapore is right there, both geographically close to major trade centers and operating within a well-known financial system. Looking for a regional hub? Sydney is right next door. Wider market, widely recognized currency. The political and trade ties between Australia and New Zealand are so strong that virtually anything an international company might want to do in New Zealand can be handled through Australia. So the conclusion is this. The only sectors still operating in New Zealand are the ones that genuinely have to be there. Tourism, local finance, local services, some regional maritime operations. These exist, of course, but given the size of the population, there's no need for anything on a massive scale. So what does the breakdown of those remaining sectors actually look like? Agriculture, strong but limited. New Zealand is one of the most fertile countries in the world when it comes to agricultural productivity. That's actually quite unexpected for a developed nation. Rich soil, abundant underground water sources, and modern technology. Because it sits in the southern hemisphere, it can supply out-of-season produce to the large markets of the northern hemisphere. If a European or Asian person stops by a supermarket and finds fresh produce, the reason might well be New Zealand. That's why it's competitive in this market, especially with its neighbor Asia, which has a lot of mouths to feed. Great, but here's the thing. Well-educated New Zealanders who grew up in cities aren't exactly lining up to work in agriculture. Farmland in this country is incredibly valuable, with price per square meter being extremely high. Someone paying that much for land is also going to spend serious money on the best machinery, which means these operations are highly mechanized and don't require much human labor. So what are the well-educated people doing? Half the economy. Housing. Interesting, isn't it? The largest portion of New Zealand's economy is made up of housing. Selling your own home, renting your own home, building new homes, financing homes, and regulating all of that. When you add it all up, you've already reached roughly half of the entire economy. And what was the result? This sparsely populated, extremely remote country has some of the most expensive real estate prices in the world. The government tried to step in. It banned people who don't live in the country from buying homes. The logic was sound. remove a source of demand, and with everything else staying equal, prices should come down. But it didn't work. Why? Because that only covered about 3% of transactions anyway. And the ban didn't apply to Australians, who were the biggest buyers. Because the agreements between the two countries run so deep that Australians are practically treated like local citizens. So why are Australians so interested? Australians have significantly more money compared to New Zealanders. Buying a holiday home or a retirement retreat in cities like Queenstown or Auckland is extremely common among wealthy Australians. The scenery is legendary, and compared to Australian home prices, it's relatively affordable. On top of that, when you buy property in Australia, there's a stamp duty. You pay nearly 3% of the home's price up front. On a home priced at $7 million, that's a serious amount of money. In New Zealand, you don't have to pay that up front, and there are tax advantages too. Prices have started to decline recently. Government strategies have made properties less attractive as investment vehicles. The changes themselves weren't that significant, but even the signal that the government wanted to do something about house prices was enough to take a lot of the excitement out of the market. Still, prices remain a problem. The real problem isn't house prices. You might be thinking, homes are expensive, young people can't afford them, so they move to another country. But that's not quite it. More than half of the young people leaving are going to Australia, and house prices there are also very high. If they were only leaving to find cheaper homes, that wouldn't make any sense. What they're actually looking for is opportunity. The sectors that survive in New Zealand are the ones that have to be there. If you live there and you don't want to work in agriculture or real estate, then the job opportunities in Australian cities are simply far greater. Logically, this makes sense too. Specialized, skilled professions tend to emerge in big cities. If you have a talent for fine arts, if you want to be a researcher or a writer, if you want to become a manager, almost none of those roles have much demand in small towns. And that's actually what sets New Zealand apart from everyone else. The big cities and large populations that give those kinds of careers room to grow and thrive are somewhere else. Like the EU, but even easier. Let's start with the European Union as a reference point. A Polish citizen can go work in Germany. An Italian can move to France. There are few restrictions, but the language is different, the culture is different, and there's an adjustment period. The dynamic between New Zealand and Australia is very different from that. People from these two countries can freely live, work, and buy homes across each other's borders with virtually no restrictions. On top of that, they speak the same language, English. Their cultures are essentially the same. When a New Zealander moves to Australia, they don't face the mountain of challenges that someone relocating from another country typically would. Australian universities don't treat students from New Zealand as foreign students. They receive the same treatment as locals. They pay the same tuition fees, and government-funded student grants are available to them too. For example, it's considered completely normal for more than half of the students who gain admission to a medical school to be from New Zealand, simply because there are more available spots in Australia. So for people from these two countries, moving is as easy as traveling. And Australian cities feel full of opportunity and appeal for young people. It's easy, but reversing it is just as hard. So how is the gap being filled? Right now, there are approximately 600,000 New Zealand-born people living in Australia. That's more than 10% of the total population living in New Zealand. Going the other way, there are nearly 90,000 Australians. But these tend to be older, wealthier retirees. Their contribution to the labor market is limited. New Zealand is struggling to fill those gaps, and it's trying to do so through immigration, primarily drawing from densely populated cities in Asia. And of course, that leads to some interesting developments. Once those immigrants settle in and get comfortable, they also end up going to Australia. Do you know why? Because getting a work visa, permanent residency, and eventually citizenship in New Zealand is relatively easier. Since the country keeps losing workers, it has to keep its doors open to newcomers. And once someone takes advantage of that and secures residency, they can move on to Australia too. And a first-generation New Zealand citizen who has only spent a few years there is far less attached to the country compared to someone who was born and raised there. So New Zealand has unknowingly turned itself into a back door leading to Australia's major cities. It's become a stepping stone to Sydney and Melbourne. Why don't they tighten things up? Great question, actually. But there's a point worth considering. 10% of New Zealand's population lives in Australia, and they're voters. They're not going to support any policy that makes their lives harder. Most people support this flexibility because it's good for them personally, even if it isn't good for the country. Geopolitically, it's not easy either. Australia and New Zealand are genuinely two of the closest, friendliest countries in the world. Forcing a tighter arrangement would create serious friction. And then there's the economic side. Yes, losing young, productive workers is very tough. But a large portion of those who leave don't go forever. Many return years later with skills and experience gained in Australia. And they usually bring significant savings with them, which feeds back into the local economy. So what's the solution? Not easy, but not impossible either. New Zealand has a relatively low debt-to-GDP ratio, which means the government has some tactical room to make big changes when necessary. But the real solution is this: offering better opportunities to young people, creating good jobs, bringing housing costs down to reasonable levels. Easier said than done, yes. But without that, the picture won't change. And this shouldn't be forgotten. New Zealand is still one of the safest, cleanest, and most stable places in the world. They can sell golden visas to billionaires. Wealthy Australians are desperate to spend their retirement there. That might sound abstract, but in economics, it genuinely matters. Beauty, safety, and stability attract people. As long as they hold on to those advantages, there will always be a long queue at their door. The real question is this: can they provide the right opportunities to make sure the people who arrive don't end up walking right back out?